Hello and welcome to Türkiye Talks. This week we are going to talk about Turkish-US relations. Turkish Foreign Minister was in Washington. He met with his counterpart and many issues were on top of the agenda, like F-16 procurement of Turkey and other bilateral issues, war against terror and all other stuff. We are going to talk these questions with Richard Outzen and Kadir Üstün. Welcome both.
Hello.
Good to be here.
Kadir, you were with the foreign minister yesterday. You had an occasion with him and there was the meeting between the U.S. Secretary of State. Maybe we can start with that. I don't know, Rich, were you able to follow what happened? Let's start with the Çavuşoğlu's statements after the meeting. Kadir.
Yeah, so yesterday was a very busy day. Both Rich and I were in multiple occasions listening to the foreign minister's remarks. This was part of a strategic mechanism dialogue that was established about a year and a half ago, I think, in Rome, on the sidelines of NATO meetings between Biden and Erdogan. And it has had several meetings. This was the second ministerial meeting. And of course, you have Ukraine issue at the top of the agenda. That was clear from Blinken's remarks. But we saw Çavuşoğlu talk about a broader agenda, including, like you said, Turkey's fight against terror, YPG in Syria, Eastern Mediterranean, and other issues in surrounding regions of Turkey. Both Rich and I think he would agree that we really have been talking about and calling for a serious strategic dialogue between these two countries, because there are a number of issues they disagree on deeply, and then there are a number of issues they really need to cooperate and work better together. They shouldn't simply, in my opinion, manage crises and freeze issues, but actually start trying to solve them, especially given, Biden won't have a lot to do internally, I think, domestic the next 2 years, now that Republicans are in charge in the House. That might give him some more room to focus on foreign policy issues. I can offer quite a few criticisms about that. There's no Middle East policy, there's no Syria policy, etc. We can go into details. But yesterday's meeting, I think, in terms of just having that strategic dialogue and trying to deepen it, I think that was positive by itself. And as I said, there are outstanding issues. We can, talk about them specifically, but I don't want to talk too long at the beginning. So I thought it was a good occasion for Minister Çavuşoğlu and Secretary of State to actually discuss these issues face to face.
What is your impression, Rich? Turkey's relations with the U.S. is sour, and we know there are lots of issues, lots of disagreement areas, basically Syria, the PKK and others. But what was your impression after a long period of time? I think we have seen a Turkish foreign minister in Washington.
That's right. And I have a long view of Turkish-U.S. relations, which, believe it or not, have not always been rosy and dreamlike. It's been a difficult relationship ever since 1952, of course, and even before that. Very different political cultures and not always a perfect overlap of interests. So what we see is a long cycle of convergence and then divergence based on U.S. domestic politics, but also the world conjuncture. So I think we've been at a very low point for the last 5 to 10 years. That's been driven by Syria. That's been driven by sort of U.S. concern over institutions and perceived democratic backsliding in Turkey, quality of Turkish democracy and so forth. And equally, in Turkey, driven by sort of suspicion of the U.S. plans or sometimes lack of plans for interventions in the Middle East, Central Asia, and other places that matter to Turkey. So we are, I think, familiar with the mutual recriminations and the mutual grievances on both sides. But we've, again, gone through cycles of this before. 1970s, for instance. I think we're even worse than they are now in the wake of disputes, bilateral disputes over Cyprus and other things. When we climb out of the hole, when we climb out of the dark periods in bilateral relationships, there's sort of a sequence of things that has to happen. And one of them is you have to reestablish a system and a framework for comprehensive talks, as Kadir said, not just managing crises as they come up and trying to keep a lid on it. And I think in that sense, this strategic mechanism is important. It was, it's, I think, almost 2 years old now as a concept. It took a while to get going. It's met, I think, 4 times total and twice at the ministerial level. It has not produced big breakthroughs on the very rooted problems that we have. But in the words of one of the Turkish representatives I talked with yesterday, it is a beginning of rebuilding mutual empathy, right? So by talking about things, not just as an exchange of talking points, but as sort of an explanation on both sides of the logic and frankly, identification of overlap areas where we can cooperate, Ukraine being a great example, rather than just focusing on problems like the S-400 and FETO and Syria and things like that. So I would characterize the meetings this week then as a qualified success. It's good that we're talking. It's clear that on things like the F-16, the administration intends to invest some political capital in trying to make progress. But of course, we have big obstacles ahead of us. So I wouldn't say that this is entirely turning a new chapter just yet, but it is certainly a step in the right direction.
Kadir, is there anything new on F-16 procurement of Turkey? Did the minister say anything about that? And how should we expect? What kind of development should we expect in this file?
Well, the ball in the Congress's yard. I mean, in Congress's court. That's been the case for a while now. Like Reed said, the White House have expressed their support, and they have kind of informally already talked to Congress, but right now they seem like they're more ready to move to the next stage, which is the formal notification. But of course, there is still probably a couple months, several weeks at least. But I think their political strategy here is to somehow combine it with the F-35 sales to Greece. That way, they can get Senator Menendez. He's the one who opposes the most. Perhaps you're not going to get his support probably, but at least he could be satisfied to some extent, given that, there will be F-35 sales to Greece at the same time as F-16s are being sold to Turkey. That seems to be the White House strategy. Of course, until the planes are actually, shipped to Turkey, there's always a possibility, things can happen and senators can block it. That's theoretically at least possible. As far as I know, there's never been a blockade of such sales, because usually the White House does these consultations with congressional members, and when they're convinced that it's going to pass, that's when they do the formal notification, and the rest is a bit of a paperwork. Of course, like the military talks on this seem to have been completed. White House is supporting it politically. They're saying it's good for NATO as well, NATO's capacity, not just for Turkey. So all is good so far. But, Congress is Congress. There is a negative view on Turkey, largely, except, Turkey's efforts on Ukraine really have, neutralized at least some of that anti-Turkey rhetoric. But it's not guaranteed, basically. We're going to have to wait until the last moment to see if a senator decides to make it maybe a political show out of it and really counter Turkey's efforts to procure these planes.
Which I wonder what is the main expectation of the U.S. from this meeting and with the relations with Turkey? Is it Ukrainian war? Is it NATO enlargement? Why Blinken? Why did he agree to meet with the Turkish Foreign Minister at this point?
Well, I think that there was a lot of energy from the Turkish side to try to put these meetings together. And the Turks have been pressing, Ankara has been pressing through its embassy here and through discussions with our embassy in Ankara to have this sort of a conversation. Of course, political attention is short in Washington. And, even this week with President Biden being embroiled in something of we'll say, political difficulty over handling of classified materials and things like that. The White House and the executive branch is usually fully occupied with domestic politics. That's kind of the way it works here. So you're right. I mean, it's a significant thing to sort of focus this level of attention. Why would the U.S. do that? Well, I think there's several lines of sort of strategic and political interest in Washington that intersect in the relationship with Turkey. Ukraine is one, and with Russia, of course, signaling no intention to lessen its efforts to knuckle under Ukraine and to solidify its hold on Donbass and Crimea. Turkey plays an outsized role in that conflict, and a role that, while it hasn't been perfectly coordinated between the U.S. and Turkey, has been largely parallel in the same direction, right? So the U.S. and Turkey are both working to support Ukraine, and I think they want to solidify that. Also, the issues in Syria with, pressure regionally to make some sort of a policy direction change. There's countries in the Gulf. Turkey signaled, if not a desire to normalize, then a desire to engage more with Damascus in order to sort of move towards a solution. There's the tensions in the Mediterranean. There's the situation in the Caucasus. And then if you look further abroad in some areas of opportunity and not just crisis, there's Central Asia, there's Afghanistan, there's Africa, places where Turkey's engaged. And frankly, there's a lot of potential cooperation. So to work in the same direction on these things, even in a time of troubled bilateral relations, is in Washington's interest. And so to have these kind of wide-ranging conversations, I think you sort of pegged two or three of the really important ones, and NATO enlargement is one of them. There's sort of this linkage in Washington, not just between the F-35s for Greece and the F-16s for Turkey, but also the idea that Turkey can be a little bit more forthcoming, at least a little bit more transparent, as former U.S. Ambassador to Turkey Robert Pearson wrote yesterday, more transparent and clear with Washington about what its strategy is. And I think we heard that. Could you tell me if you see it differently? But I think what we heard in the meetings and the outbriefs from Minister Çavuşoğlu's visit yesterday is that Turkey does support NATO enlargement, supports it for Ukraine, supports it for Georgia, supports it for Finland. I think Finland is closer, but still linked with Sweden. But in the Turkish view, there is this tripartite memorandum that was signed between Sweden, Finland, and Turkey. And Turkey's not going to simply ignore that and jump right to full acceptance absent some movement on PKK-related issues. So I think all of those play into why Washington had time for these meetings and is anxious to see them succeed.
Yeah, I think Turkey's expectations are really important. I don't know if you heard or had the impression on that, Kadir, what was the attitude of the foreign minister? Should we expect a quick acceptance from Turkey, or Turkey, do you think, will push more for at least getting a few names from Sweden or Finland from the list that were delivered to them?
Yeah, I mean, NATO membership, like Rich mentioned, Turkey actually has been supporting the open door policy for a long time. That's often forgotten. And, Turkey has pushed for Georgia's membership, Ukraine's membership. I think recently Bosnia's membership as well. So the NATO enlargement obviously benefits Turkey. Turkey is a strong NATO member. Finland and Sweden can potentially, theoretically, as far as military experts say, they would add to the alliance. That's not where Turkey's dispute comes from. Turkey's point about terrorism is more focused on Sweden. They don't see a lot of the attitude change. They've seen some legislation passed, constitutional changes made in Sweden, but some of the things on the ground are still problematic, and some extradition requests have been made against some, people who are considered in Turkey to have been involved in the coup attempt in 2016. But I think a closer, perhaps, cooperation based on that trilateral agreement that was signed between Finland and Sweden and Turkey, it could eventually be resolved. I didn't see ideological opposition to or principled opposition to the membership of these countries in NATO. But I think one angle was congressional members, U.S. congressional members who may not be very familiar with the details of Turkey's kind of hesitation about Finland and Sweden. They are asking questions. Hey, are they on the same page as us about enlarging NATO? So outside Menendez, who is focused on Greece perhaps, or he's also asking NATO questions, I'm sure, but there may be other senators who might ask questions about other things about Turkey. So that comes up in that context as well. And from what I could see, like Rich said, Foreign Minister conveyed a clear message that Turkey is not opposed to enlargement, is not opposed to specific countries' membership, but they want reassurances that, these countries care about the security of Turkey, especially in terms of counterterrorism. So of course, it's not going to happen before the elections, and I think next NATO summit is not until June, something like that. So this will be a while, but there is some sort of, there's this debate. Is it related to F-16s? Do you want Turkey to say, we will accept Finland and Sweden if you give us F-16s, and vice versa? That debate, and officials are saying, there should be no linkage between the two, but politically there is some linkage because congressional members will want reassurances from the White House that somehow, on the big issues, Turkey and U.S. were on the same page. But again, going back to F-16s, this should not be an issue, to be honest. Turkey has been using these systems for a long time. There's no argument against it on the basis of it either undermining NATO, like S-400 argument was made before, or somehow it's, going to be detrimental to any U.S. interests. Turkey has been using these systems for a long time. So it's a little politics on the hill. I don't want to minimize it. It is serious, but at the same time, there is some politics involved, and there is a question between whether this NATO enlargement should be tied to the F-16 sales.
If I could just add one coda to that as well, it's not just Capitol Hill. I saw Ragıp Soylu's tweet this morning about the Economist's cover on the elections in Turkey, shall we say. It's an entire issue apparently devoted to that, with the title of Turkey's dictatorship.
Right?
Yeah. So this looming election and the idea, so many people in Europe and in the United States, left of center and centrists even, have an issue with Erdogan, right? So President Erdogan is a polarizing figure. And I think what some have called reductio ad Erdoganum has some purchase in Europe as well as in the United States, where people politically tend to view Turkey and the U.S.-Turkish relationship through the prism of President Erdogan, his personality, his strength, his politics, his weaknesses. So this idea that the F-16s would be a win for him, right? I think there's a hesitance in Europe and in Washington to give something that would be considered a win to President Erdogan in the run-up to the elections. Of course, those of us who've studied the bilateral relationship try not to reduce it to the personalities of a given president, either in the United States or in Turkey. So looking at things like the long-term deterrent strength of NATO on its southern flank and the need for balance in the Mediterranean and so forth, these are issues which inform the geopolitical view of F-16s and the bilateral relationship. But in Washington, there is this focus on the elections and on the personalities.
Let me just add, I wrote this particular part in a piece in Turkish, and White House itself, I said, might be hesitant about, giving a quote-unquote win to Erdogan, and that's the nature of politics. But if you wait, there's not a lot of rationale for waiting either, because unless some, congressional hold is placed on the sale process, for White House, the military talks have been completed, and, it's good for NATO, it's good for relations with Turkey. They don't see a major problem with it. So if they waited, then it could have created even more problems with Turkey. I think they have the timing right, and it's not going to be necessary. It's not a new system. So in that sense, it's not such, I don't think it's a big win for Erdogan, but that's how it's presented often. That's true.
On this issue of sort of can a congressman, one member or one senator block the deal at the end if the administration pushes hard for it and has come to the conclusion that it should do it? My understanding of the mechanics of this is that that's not possible. What they can do is they can demand a full vote. Normally what happens is the administration notifies a sale. There's a waiting period. There's no objection after 30 days or 60, whatever it is. The sale goes through. But a senator can, and there's been at least one senator who said he would, demand that there be a vote on it. They can put a hold. But if the administration pushes for it, if President Biden invests the capital with his leadership on the House and Senate side, especially on the Senate, then they're probably going to win that vote. That's the history of it. There has been no case in which a major sale that a U.S. administration of either party has pushed for that when brought to a vote has failed. So as Kadir said earlier, the president probably won't do that unless he thinks he's got the votes lined up already. But if that deal is done and the Pentagon, State Department, and the White House all support it, I don't think it can be stopped. It can be certainly turned into a circus, but it probably won't be stopped if that's what President Biden chooses to do.
That's right, yeah.
I was going to ask questions about the Syrian policy and that issue, but because you mentioned the Economist cover, always we have seen this in the Western media, mainstream media, painting Turkey in a certain way, this word of authoritarianism, etc. Among us, I am the one who lives in Turkey, and I can tell you, for the last couple months, maybe longer, President Erdogan is working so hard to convince people. So it's not, he is able to, get more than 50 with undemocratic ways. It's clear. He has worked on minimum wages, early retirement. Every day he's trying to show that, they are working and opening new tunnels, etc. So for our audience in the West, I should say that there is a really hard and great competition to get the votes of the people. So it's not that easy and that simple. I would like to ask you about the Syrian issue. I don't expect personally a change in Washington's recent, I don't want to say it policy, but recent status in Syria. But what happened between Blinken and Çavuşoğlu? Do you think, what is the approach of the U.S. About Turkey's new approach to, you mentioned a little bit, President Erdogan is maybe looking for ways to meet with his Syrian counterpart, or maybe lesser level meetings can be held. The defense minister already met. What is the how Washington sees this reapproachment between Turkey and Syrian regime. Rich.
So I think there was a sort of worst case interpretation prevalent in Washington a couple of weeks ago, and part of this is fed by the press as well, describing what Turkey is doing, what Ankara is doing as normalization or a move towards normalization. I've never thought that was likely for a couple of different reasons. One is it's not in Turkey's interest. We saw Assad come out and say, no normalization and no big meetings until Turkey ends its occupation and all the Turkish troops are out. Well, look, as a practical matter, Turkey has a PKK threat on its southern border. That's a fact, and Turkey can't afford to end its security presence there until that's dealt with politically and militarily. Secondly, there's the issue of Syrians. There's 4 million or close to 4 million Syrians in Turkey. There's another, 5 million or so Syrians who live in areas that Turkey is helping to stabilize in the north right now. And for Turkey to simply walk away from that right now would engender another humanitarian catastrophe and probably lead to widespread retaliation of the regime against the oppositionists there. So it's not a situation where Turkey can really afford to do that. But I think what we heard from the Turks in Washington this week from the Turkish delegation was that, look, we can't do anything about moving towards a political solution of this conflict unless we engage with them. And engagement doesn't mean legitimization. Engagement doesn't mean normalization. Engagement doesn't mean that all of a sudden President Erdogan is going to align himself with Assad and the Russians and against Western interests there, because Turkey shares much of the Western interest. Turkey does not want to see Assad sort of legitimized after what he's done. Turkey does not want to see another humanitarian catastrophe. Turkey wants to see continued humanitarian assistance into the area. And by the way, Turkey is now engaged in a real competition and conflict at sort of under the table level in Iraq and Syria with Iran. So part of what we see in terms of the outreach and diplomatic talks between Turkish officials, Russian officials, and to some extent the outreach with Assad is driven by this realpolitik, the idea that to preserve its interests, Turkey has to engage, but that does not represent a flipping of its strategic position and general alignment, other than the YPG issue, which is a significant one, with regards to the end of conflict issues. So I think what happened this week is that Ankara tried to, that Minister Çavuşoğlu tried to assuage American concerns and say, look, don't worry, we're not making a deal with Assad. We're not going back on sort of the things that we do have in common as interests in Syria, but we're trying to be pragmatic here.
What about Turkish-Greek relations? I think this is one of the priorities. You already mentioned that Turkey's purchase of F-16s can be aligned to F-35 purchase of Greece. Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu talked about the recent developments in the Aegean Sea. Turkey is expecting Greece to disarm the islands, which should be so. Actually, Kadir, is there anything new about that? Is what I think the foreign minister brought this issue to Blinken's table. What was the reaction? What is the reaction he got from the American side?
Well, the reaction, I didn't hear much about it, but Turkey has registered its concerns about this. One thing is, it plays to domestic Greek politics probably to have American, bases in Greece and then say that this is somehow going to protect Greece against Turkey. But obviously the U.S. administration won't, see it that way. It won't. They deny that it's an activity against Turkey or somehow to counterbalance Turkey. But Turkey is concerned. They say, there's been a balanced policy between Turkey and Greece. United States, whatever, systems or weapon systems or strategic support they've given to these countries, they always sought to balance it between the two. But both these American weapons that were placed in some of the islands in the Aegean Sea, as well as lifting of the embargo, arms embargo to Cyprus, these were problematic decisions, and they do want answers. We've discussed this with you, Bora, many times. At the end of the day, Turkey is very self-confident, and I don't think they're super scared of Greece, but that's not where the discussion should be about, right? These are neighboring countries. They're NATO allies. They should be cooperating. They should be doing things together, etc. So that's not where the concern is, but the concern is where the U.S. strategy might be headed. And there are definitely concerns about the potential sales of arms to Greek Cypriots. That would change the balance in the island. The Turkish side on the island has been, seeking to gain their rights and etc. That's a long-standing, very important frozen conflict, but it has the potential to flare because there are, energy resources founded around the island, etc. So this is a complex issue, but the military investment, especially in Greece, is a concern for Turkey. But I haven't seen a clear reassurance about that given to Turkey about, on the and I don't expect them to say it anytime soon, especially the dynamic we talked about earlier in Congress. There is a pro-Greece sentiment. It could derail the potential F-16 sales if the administration were to try to tell Turkey that, oh no, they weren't going to support Greece and they weren't doing these things to support Greece. I'm just talking hypotheticals here, but administration has to walk a careful line, so I'll give it to them as well. But Turkey remains concerned. And is it the top of the agenda? I don't think so, but it is pretty high up in the agenda, top 5 items, I would say. So that's going to continue to be an issue between the two.
Rich, you are a geopolitical analyst, much better than many of the people probably in Washington. Turkey is one of the key, maybe the key country in the region if you want to contain Russia. And it's not only Ukraine and the Black Sea, but also Eastern Mediterranean, because they have the alliance with the regime, plus they have naval and air bases near Turkey at the coast of Eastern Mediterranean. So Cyprus is an issue between Turkey and Greece, as well as Turkish and Greek Cypriots. But once you go into this and when you take provocative measures from Turkish point of view, when the US, starts educating, training Greek Cypriots, so it will, at some point, there is possibility of an escalation between Turkey and Greece. Do you think, I really don't understand why it's happening. Is there a rational idea from the US point of view, instead of finding a fair solution, or at least freezing the situation without leading it to another escalation while you are competing with Russia, trying to contain Russia? How do you evaluate the US attitude and policy on that? Eastern Mediterranean is an important region and question in terms of energy and geopolitics. As a geopolitical analyst, I'd like to hear your opinion on that regarding Turkish American foreign ministers meeting.
Sure. Well, I think the U.S. has not produced a comprehensive strategy for the Eastern Mediterranean. We don't have a strategy really for Syria, at least not one that's evident. Certainly there's the adherence to UN Resolution 2254, UNSCR 2254. But really, I don't think anybody can figure out what exactly is the end game for the U.S. with regards to Syria. What exactly is the end game for the U.S. with regards to energy resources and energy sharing in the Eastern Mediterranean? There's sort of a big gap to the extent that Washington talks about energy in the Eastern Mediterranean. It doesn't talk about Turkey at all. It talks about trying to foster cooperation between other countries, littoral countries in the Mediterranean. But I think this, like from the lens of geopolitics, there's a big gap in synoptic thinking. We're not thinking of this region as a system, right? We're thinking of it as discrete problems. And we're thinking of it as a series of discrete problems that we have to manage primarily with concern for domestic politics, right? So nobody wants another big war in the Middle East after Iraq and Libya and all that. So that limits what we're going to do, the appetite for sort of new energy on the Syria file. We're definitely invested in Israel's security. That's one strong part of our policy with regards to the Mediterranean in general. I don't think that we can think of the U.S. training of Greek or Cypriot Greek forces in that same way. It's not like it's categorically different from our support to Israel, but there is a general sympathy for the Cypriots and for the Greeks, and there's larger sort of diaspora communities in the region or in the United States from that region, and not a very active Turkish diaspora in the United States. So the voices we hear from the region tend to be those coming from Athens and from the Greek Cypriot side, and they are painting a narrative of threat. They say that, look, after what's Turkey's done in the Caucasus and in Libya and in Syria and elsewhere, it's an aggressive power. And so they're selling in Washington this idea that aggressive power could be applied against the Greeks in Cyprus or in the Mediterranean. The Greeks appear to, at least at some level, actually think that there's a chance that Turkey will try to question Greek sovereignty over some of the islands in the Aegean. And this has purchase in Washington because Washington has been, again, engaging in reductio ad Erdoganum, which is seeing everything through the lens of President Erdogan. And frankly, some of his rhetoric and some of the things said in frustration, really, I think, in Ankara about the Greek positions and sort of very vocally anti-Turkish positions taken by Greeks, including by the Prime Minister in the U.S. Congress. This leads to harsh words on each side. And those harsh words, combined with Turkey's military activism over the last several years, explain a lot of why there is this lack of balance, because Washington, to the extent that it's concerned with the Eastern Mediterranean, tends to see Turkey as the thing that's upsetting the status quo. So it's almost a deterrence rather than the traditional posture. If you go back to the 70s and 80s, which the United States understood this is a difficult relationship and that they need to play sort of a balancing role and a stabilizing role. So we'll wait and see if that changes over time, if there's a maturation of the strategic mechanism, if there's better dialogue. Perhaps there'll be some more outreach to Turkey to try to bring them together with the Greeks and address both sides' concerns. But to go back to your original question, I think this is an area where it's kind of on the borders of the Middle East, on the borders of Europe. We don't want to be super active. There's this pivot to Asia, and people just don't want to mess with solving these very difficult problems. Ergo, we have no real regional systemic approach. If we had one, we'd behave differently with regards to two allies, really kind of three allies, if you include Cyprus as well, that are in this very difficult triangle that really needs a big brother, a big Abi, to try to loosen some of the knot.
Well, thank you very much, Rich. Thank you, Kadir, for your comments after the meeting of Turkish and American foreign ministers. We tried to understand what's going on between Turkey and US at this point of the history, let's say. Thank you very much. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Bora.
See you guys.